Wim Drees is the academic secretary for the Social Sciences and Humanities of the Royal Holland Society of Sciences and Humanities. He is professor emeritus of philosophy of religion at Leiden University and of philosophy of the humanities at Tilburg University. He has served as president of ESSSAT, the European Society for the Study of Science and Theology, and as editor of Zygon, Journal of Religion and Science. Among his publications are What Are the Humanities For? Religion and Science in Context, A Guide to the Debates, Creation from Nothing Until Now, Religion, Science, and Naturalism, and Beyond the Big Bang, Quantum Cosmologies and God. Welcome, Bim.
Thank you. Hope this works. Thank you for the invitation to do this presentation. I'll try to start my presentation. Does this? Oh, here. Hope this works well for you. So I'm not a historian. Was trained in philosophy of religion, but this is mainly a philosophical or a historical lecture. That's the first kind of subtitle. It has been communicated, I think, with two different subtitles. Why a religious and political motto for this scholarly society? This Latin phrase, Deo et Patriae, God and fatherland, God and country, or for God and for country. How did that come about in the 18th century? But then there is also the present, whether it's still our motto. Here you see the seal of the society, which has clearly this motto at the top and two symbolic figures. I'll say a few things about them later. And the text underneath also in Latin abbreviated.
Vim, I'm sorry to interrupt, but we're seeing your screen instead of just your slides. So stop sharing and go back in and make sure that we're just seeing the slide, not the next slide.
Now I see myself. And this should then be, no? Here. Does this work this way?
No, that's still we're seeing the current slide and the next one and your notes. You had chosen the window earlier that is just the slide.
Just the slide and next to each other, maybe. This one. Now the slide and myself to the side.
Nope, not that one.
Oh. Oh.
Now we're seeing two of you, and the slide is really small.
No, the slide should be big. Oh, and it is big on my other screen.
When we did this earlier, it was perfect.
Yes. Okay. Try
So
once more.
in your when you hit share, the green share button, there may be two options that have PowerPoint, and you want the one that only shows the slide.
Oh, no. Oh, this one. No, I don't see it, but maybe you see it.
That's it. Well, no, now if we're seeing you and the slide,
okay,
but it's better. Let's stick with that. That'll work.
Okay. So the title is a Latin motto, Deo et Patriae, for God and country, which you here also see on the seal of the society at the top. This society is founded in 1752, and as a newly appointed secretary of the society, I was expected to deliver a lecture at the annual meeting, and I chose to reflect upon this issue, why this society, which is a scientific society, like your National Academy of Sciences or something like that, why it has a motto and still has this motto that has clearly a religious and a political element to it. That's a historical question, but it's also a question for us today. No, no, I'm not moving to the side. Yeah. So the outline of the presentation, I start with saying a few things about the society. Then I go back to the history and saying, how was it founded in 1752? I put that in a historical context of the Dutch Republic. Then go back to this historical period, who were the founders? And then the more general question, how does that fit in the 18th century? Oh, in the 18th century context. Is there anything I should do? I now see I lost my video. Yeah, maybe that's part of what I missed. Okay, so this is kind of historical, present, past, context, past, and then again larger context. And the last section is about today, the motto today. Doesn't move to the right. Yes. So nowadays it's called the Royal Holland Society of Sciences and Humanities. That royal was not there when it was founded. And it currently has about 500 academic members, so mostly full professors, and 500 societal members. Up to 2 years ago, they were called the directors of the society, and they are both from businesses, profit, and also non-profit museum directors and others. We do over 100 awards each year for well, even high school students, but mostly master's theses and dissertations and other awards. We have a few subsidies. We call them stimuli, the largest being €1 million, funded by a wealthy donor for a mid-career scientist, any subject, and another one just starting this year of €400,000, which should be in organizational studies. This year it will be on the impact of AI on how humans work. We do symposia and so on. We are fully privately funded. There's no government funding. Back to the history, we were founded by prominent citizens in Haarlem, a small, no, not small, a city in the western part of the Netherlands, west of Amsterdam in 1752. And we became royal at our 250th anniversary in 2002. And we have been royal in a brief period in the early 19th century when there was a French king, a brother of Napoleon, as king of the Netherlands. Yeah. Let me list some historical highlights. The society used to support the sciences by posing prize questions. There have been over 1,000 or 1,200. And they started with very applied interests on rivers, very Dutch, on dikes, dunes, also on diseases, but also natural history, but also on how to raise children, both physically and mentally, and on theological subjects, and well, many different topics. By the mid-19th century, it became more pure science. That corresponds to the development of science, become more a profession. Among our major publications, there's a complete edition of the works of Christian Huygens, who was a Dutch, well, scientist of an earlier century. And I listed just two of our foreign members, elected in 1805, because it might be of interest: John Adams, who had been American second president, and Thomas Jefferson, who was actually the president at the time, and was also the president of the American Philosophical Society in Philadelphia at the same time that he was national president. Maybe a model for some others to pile up on different positions. Another historical highlight, well, the most illustrious predecessor is Hendrik Anton Lorentz, who has been a Dutch physicist, Nobel Prize winning the second time in 1902. And this was when he had his 50th anniversary of his doctorate. and he's sitting in the front row in the middle in major chair. And there are actually, for his 50th doctorate, 6 Nobel Prizes, 5 Nobel Prize winners in the picture. There's Lawrence, who won it early in the, and then there's to his left, Madame Curie, who won it twice, chemistry and physics. In the other, there's behind her, there's Peter Zeeman, who won it jointly with Lawrence. And slightly more to the left for us, there is Einstein, and behind Einstein, there's Niels Bohr. So those came all for his 50th anniversary of his doctorate. So that shows some of his important network in the scientific community, especially, I think, in restoring scientific connections after the World War One. Last of the, well, historical highlights, we have a home of ourselves, which is also an 18th century building, which was built by a very wealthy young lady who had become an orphan and inherited quite a sum. And she had on the river the Sparne built a kind of a city palace. And the main floor is very illustrious. On the right, there you see that there's next to it also a kind of hall that is now our main hall. That's a later addition. So we have a very nice location. Now for the historical part of it, more to the title of the initial aim was defined, so mid 18th century, to pursue the glory of God and the pursuit of the well-being of our fellow humans, especially of our country, be the unvarying law of this society and the main aim of its directors and members. So you see there, the word science doesn't appear. It's about the glory of God and the well-being of our fellow humans. That is the kind of way it defined itself, and that's a very typical 18th century choice. By the way, the picture on the side is part of the building I just showed on the rooftop. The purpose was changed officially in the mid-19th century, in 1861. There it becomes more sober. The purpose of the society is the advancement of the sciences. So there you see a kind of narrowing and professionalization. And nowadays the law has kind of twofold structure. The society is established to advance the sciences and to build a bridge between science and society. Or maybe for the American participants, I should say, the word science is somewhat broader in Dutch, like in German, Wetenschap, Wissenschaft. It includes the whole domain of learning rather than the natural sciences, social sciences, more limited. So that's the kind of historical background. But so the purpose in the beginning was broad. The name was actually not decided until the second year of its existence. Then there was a proposal on the table to call the publications, the transactions of the Holland Society for the Advancement of Business, useful for the fatherland and the religion. Again, nothing about science. There was one of his early members, a professor from Leiden University, wrote a letter saying, well, this is all very fine. And of course, the sciences are good for religion and for the well-being of the country, but you don't need to put it all in the title, and just keep a much shorter title, which was decided also still early 1753 to name it the Hollandse Maatschappij der Wetenschappen, so the Holland Society for the Sciences, or for the Sciences and Humanities, as we nowadays write. So the name was decided and stayed more or less the same, with some variation, this royal and so on, due to political changes. But you see in the name already the focus on, or focus, but this political and religious connotation. Those prize questions, winners of the prize questions, they received a gold medal, massive gold, which was the award. So none of those have survived, as far as I know. They probably have all been melted and converted into regular, money. But this is a later version of the but of the metal. Actually, we made new die to have those pressed in metals this year, and this is the new one. And there you see the motto at the top. You see on the left for us a figure with a hand stretched out. She stands for faith, for fiducia, a kind of spirit flame on her head. She rests an arm on the Bible, and the other arm shows the kind of open field of inquiry, as it's supposed to be. The other figure is more the kind of Minerva or Athena figure in symbolic language of Greek mythology, standing for a more political and military orientation. Um, Standing here for the fatherland, for the country, with a spear that has a particular cap, that's a freedom cap. And on our side, you see the seal, the coat of arms of the Dutch Republic. This lion has actually 7 arrows because it's a united 7 provinces. So that's the kind of one side of the seal. Um, and the other side, which was given this seal or a seal, this medal to winners of the prize questions, has also a Latin phrase, optime meritus, for the one who most well deserves the prize. There you see the truth, an almost naked woman with an olive, how do you say, olive crown and palm leaves. And in the background, you see the city of Haarlem. Actually, we have recently identified also the mill that's in there. The main church is still there. This was, and underneath, now this is the new one. It says Society Recus. So for the Royal Society for the Sciences, Holland Premium. The word order in Latin is different from the word order we would use. Here, so you see, women were present only as symbolic figures in the early time. It took very long until 1907 when Madame Curie was actually made a foreign member, and a Dutch member was not appointed until 1928. And for the directors, so the societal members, it even took until 1987 when the sitting members, the men couldn't avoid it anymore, as Haarlem had got a female major, and well, the major of Haarlem was always a member, so it became kind of necessary, no longer avoidable, to postpone that. Nowadays, for the younger generation at least, it's more or less 50-50. So that is kind of imagery of the society. There you see this motto, Deo et Patriae. In what context did it come? It's the Dutch Republic, as it's called. 7 provinces, Holland being the most dominant one, Frisia, Zeeland, Utrecht being also others. No. A republic, sovereignty rested with the States General, a kind of Congress representing the different provinces. There was the stadtholder. There were some periods without a stadtholder, but who was the commander of the fleet and the army. So he was basically a civil servant rather than a royal. Though the House of Orange people did try to become more and more royal, but that took until after the French period, after Napoleonic time, before it became a kingdom. Politically speaking, it was dominated by the Protestant Reformed line. So in the Reformation, you have Lutherans and Calvinists and others, but this was the more Calvinist line. But within this Protestant world, there were clearly very strict groups and more moderate orientations. In Dutch, those who were rekkelijk, who would stretch things, and those who were very precise. And my general impression is those in leadership positions tended to be more on the moderate side, and those, the strict ones would often be more the somewhat less wealthy members of the Dutch Republic. Had a certain amount of tolerance for Jews, of course, Spinoza being the most famous Jew from the Netherlands, Mennonites, Catholics, mostly in the south of the country, but they weren't politically powerful. We're known for our golden age, Rembrandt and Vermeer and the like, but in the 18th century there's economic decline, and that was a concern for wealthy citizens of Haarlem and others, and a part of the push for investing in science, trying to find new things. First, about this Protestant orientation, the main confessional document, the Dutch Confession of Faith, called Confessio Belgica, actually has a famous article too that speaks about how do we know about God. We know him, referring to God, by two means. First, by the creation, preservation, and government of the universe, which is before our eyes as a most elegant book, wherein all creatures, great and small, are as so many characters leading us to contemplate the invisible things of God, namely his eternal power and divinity. All which things are sufficient to convince man and leave them without excuse. And then secondly, he makes himself more clearly and fully known to us by his holy and fine word. So there's the Bible, but that's second. And there's the world of nature, of the universe, which is a way of knowing about God. That was part of the cultural, religious climate that allowed, in a sense, for science, and is therefore a kind of important background that was legitimate. Speaking of the science in the Dutch Republic, there was only one university allowed in each province. That's one reason why Haarlem didn't have a university. Leiden was first in the Holland, and so it pushed for this society to have a form of a scientific activity without competing with Leiden. And typically, a university would have three higher faculties: theology, training for the ministry, law, and medicine. So they would be aimed at, well, important social functions. And one lower faculty, as was called, philosophy, which included the arts, languages, sciences, as we would call it nowadays. So the higher ones were clearly professional, orient towards particular professions. And often people would study first as kind of preliminary course of studies in the philosophy faculty and then move on to the higher faculties. And that is a European pattern well into the 19th century. Okay, back to the historical context of this society. So the founders were officially directors, called directors. They were funding the society, so they were fairly wealthy individuals. Were a couple of young, they were around 30 years, some were still in their 20s, burgomasters, so leaders of the city, aldermen, who had a certain economic concern about decline. The portrait is the one who was in the first 30 years, 15 times the president of the society for 1 year, but clearly the key figure. They were all reformed. Otherwise, they wouldn't have been in city governance. Catholics or others would not be accepted in governance positions. But within the reformed sphere, they were moderate. This man had links with Hugo de Groot and later the brothers de Witt in his family tree. The first secretary actually was an exception. He was the local Lutheran minister. But then Lutherans were the first of the Protestant Reformation, and the Calvinists considered them at least respectable. Was a minister van der Aan, and he was it for over 40 years. And he came up when they discussed for the first time this prize medal. He came up with the formula Deo et Patriae, and also the kind of rough sketch of what should be on there. So the directors were very important. There were 7 founding directors, members. In the first year, there were about 16, I think, appointed. They were not all from Haarlem. They were also appointed from elsewhere. Mostly they were ministers. There were a couple of ministers there, a couple of medical doctors, a couple of people, I call them civil engineers, who were working in polar management, water management, important for the Netherlands, but also a couple of professors in theology and in philosophy, also one in law. So it reflected to some extent the university, but mostly professionals who were not in the university. And in the first decade, there were no dissenters. Within the Reformed family, there had been a major split. There were no Mennonites, no Catholics, no Jews. So it was clearly focused on the mainstream Protestant. But just to show its liberal orientation, already some years later, 1786, they appointed one of his foreign members, Joseph Priestley, and he had been rather controversial for his writings, discovery of oxygen, but also for his writings on theology. But for the society at that point, that was no longer an issue. One member actually resigned from the society over this appointment. Yeah. Just one member to illustrate. The second member after Van der Aa was Jan Engelman, a local medical doctor from Haarlem, who became actually a head of the water management, polder management for the polder adjacent to Haarlem. Long records they have over meteorological records. And he had just published a few years before a book called Theology of Snow. This is just one page. There are over 200 pages of these drawings. He used to go out when it was freezing cold and there was snow to sketch snowflakes. So these are drawings of snowflakes. There are over 200 or so in the book. But he also makes all kinds of arguments about water freezing or snow being white, which is very helpful in dark nights if you're out in the field, because then you see more. All kinds of arguments about snow. Typically, the kind of reasoning you see is what's called natural theology, seeing this kind of harmony of how everything fits together and is designed for the best possible, in the best possible way. It stands in tradition of two German philosophers, Christian Wolff and Gottfried Leibniz, famous for arguing this is the best of all possible worlds. He's actually challenged at some point when he has a toothache by a famous writer in the Netherlands, female sister-in-law. And that's a bit like Voltaire challenging a Pangloss in Candide after the tsunami that hit Lisbon in 1755. Well, if this is the best of all possible worlds, what about suffering, about evil? But he is, for him, and he's fairly typical, I think it still fits very much together. Just a few of the other early members. There's another minister of a French-speaking Protestant church, Gijs, and he advocated for variolation, for inoculation against smallpox. This is not vaccination. It was not yet cowpox that were discovered as being helpful and not so threatening. These were live human smallpox infections that they would do, which was far more dangerous. But anyhow, he was advocating for that. So it's not that the ministers were against modern developments. Another early member was Alberti, a professor of theology at Leiden. He is somewhat early example of historical biblical studies, and that is for the Orthodox always very challenging if it doesn't fit together. Another more natural science, Petrus van Musschenbroek, inventor of the Leiden jar, a way of storing electricity, who has in his writings clearly that empirical science relies on God's reliability. If God would rule the world differently every day, you couldn't do anything with empirical science. Or another one, Gobius, successor of Hermann Boerhaave, a kind of founding figure of medicine. He was chemist, pharmacy, how divine providence is manifest in nature, and also in the history of the university when he had to do a lecture for an anniversary. But anyhow, shows some of the diversity, but also how they were, in a sense, all of a very positive-minded kind of religious, but not the religion was the kind of framework that was helpful to do their work. Or which brings me to the kind of general question: how does this organization fit in the context of thinking of the Enlightenment? In middle 18th century is typically the Enlightenment. Um, there's an American author, Jonathan Israel, who has written extensively on the Enlightenment. A major book is called Radical Enlightenment. He praises Spinoza very much and traces a lot to him. And that's the kind of voice for well, anti-religious, or at least anti-established religion, uh, enlightenment. That's not what we find here. We find a kind of moderate, of reformed enlightenment. Why is it enlightenment? Well, I think it's enlightenment because for all of them, it's the emphasis on observation, reasoning, experiment. There's no appeal to authority, not the authority of church or scripture or of the state. So they move within a Protestant environment, but they are not confessional in the sense of appealing to confessions as if those would be arguments in the scientific sphere. If you try to think how does that compare to the present situation? Well, I think there are a couple of developments since the mid 18th century. There's continuity. I think if you study in detail their work, you see development of natural sciences. They are building, kind of natural history, inventory of what is there and trying to systematize that. They do some physics experiments, all kinds of medical studies. It's still, I'm happy I'm living a life today rather than in those days, but it's clearly part of the development of the sciences. But there is also certain discontinuity. The religious frame and also the metaphysical frame of best of all possible worlds, those kind of ideas, don't think that is in the same way still ours. And of course, the religious frame as a personal issue, faith has also lost its self-evidence. It's no longer in the same way. If I look at the current membership, there are outspoken advocates of atheism, but there are also many who are fairly indifferent, and some are surprised. There's still theology as well in this among the prizes that we award, or religious studies, but it can also be biblical studies or theology. But some are surprised, and that's part of our spectrum. But anyhow, it's no longer so self-evident as it was in that time. Oh, just for comparison, some other organizations. I looked at the American Philosophical Society, associated mainly with Benjamin Franklin, but Adams and Jefferson, I mentioned before, were also, I think, Jefferson was the president of it. Adams, anyhow, there you find a seal, which has at the bottom nullo discriminate. That comes from a text where it is used to say, well, we shouldn't discriminate against the refugees that come from Troy. It plays into Homer's narrative, but it's used more general for treat with no distinction. So everyone should be able, I think, to contribute. The seal itself is clearly, dated, we might say. You see a well-dressed European-style gentleman and a Native American approaching Minerva, the goddess of learning, and a couple of instruments. But he is introducing, in a sense, the Native American. So there is a kind of, well, probably for the Americans more clearly, kind of historical background to this that might not be used in the same way today. But the motto is not religious. it's more, and the whole display is more about the rise of science in the new world. We all will contribute, and we are working on it. This predates the founding of the United States itself, I think. I looked at some other scholarly societies. The older one is the Royal Society in Britain, London. Nullius in verba. Take nobody's word for it. So again, there's no an in their rules. There's explicitly a ruling not to discuss religion or politics. But this is more about science using experiments, observations, but not going by the authority of anybody. The French Academy of Sciences, infinit et perficit, to discover and accomplish. So it's also more about the process of discovery and using discoveries. The American Academy of Arts and Sciences, so libertate florent, so they flourish under liberty. Again, more in the political context, I think, of the United States. The Royal Society of Edinburgh, I didn't find a Latin motto, but knowledge made useful. So this applied side. And in 19th century, American Association for the Advancement of Science. I also only found an English language motto, advancing science, serving society. So you see a move from Latin to local language, English. But the common element there is maybe about the culture that needs science. Don't trust anybody's word. Don't take it by authority. And also the applied science that it needs to be made useful to serve society. For this society, this Dutch society, why does it have a religious frame for the study of nature? What does it do? Well, classic idea about natural theology is that it serves to legitimize faith. And then you get arguments for the existence of God, and those are discussed and criticized. Actually, in this time, this period, David Hume comes with his, challenges to those kind of design arguments. And 1802, you have Willem Paley, a book titled Natural Theology, which becomes the kind of classic, often contrasted with Darwin as a design argument. I don't find that in the early years of nor in the later years of the Holland Society. The faith was self-evident for them. It wasn't in need of being legitimized. It was the other side. The religious frame was a frame that allowed for the study of nature. That's why I mentioned this confessional statement that we know God by studying nature. Inquiry is a religious obligation. And science needed that. In those years, science was relatively marginal and vulnerable. It didn't have this kind of body of well-established knowledge that you have, say, in the periodic table of elements in chemistry or other spheres. It was still very much in flux. So science, in a sense, could use the message, well, this is respectable. So I think that's the main background, maybe. There's a second one, that this religious framework was also more effective rather than only an intellectual argument. This is a picture of a Naturalism cabinet, so kind of collection of objects from nature, and there may be, alligators, but also shells or minerals. It can be a very mixed collection. This one is from Germany, Pietist school, but so too for the Holland Society. It had the earliest museum in the Netherlands, precisely of this type, but they didn't take care of it. And at some point, the remainders were sold to artists, to the main zoo in the Netherlands. But what's the role? It's not only to do systematics. It's still very much also to be impressed by nature. And that's also, I think, this Engelman I mentioned before, who had those snowflakes. Oh, it's 400 types of snowflakes that he had. So he went out in cold nights to make those drawings. Um, uh, well, he didn't really make a theory on the basis of those 400 drawings, but it was just overwhelming to see the abundance of nature. It was more kind of affective focus, a kind of religious experience focus than an argument. Which brings me to the present, whether this motto, Deo et Patriae, again, here you see it on the seal of the society, um, uh, could be a motto for a time. A minor side remark at the bottom, you see that it's the seal of the Society Scientiarum Batavo. This version actually is from a later moment, when the French Revolution had also affected the Netherlands, and we called ourselves the Batav Republic. But I, I do think there are reasons to be concerned about this motto. For a purely scientific sense, it seems to appeal this Deo to an authority that is itself beyond scrutiny. And an appeal to divine authority even makes it more problematic in the sense that it's totally out of reach for us. And it doesn't say it should be the Protestant version of it, but of course implicitly references to God refer to a particular understanding of God and thereby exclude others and hide how particular the interpretation is that people give to God. So there's concerns, and I wouldn't be surprised if some of the Americans have similar concerns nowadays in how appeals to, well, religious truth function, and the reference to Patriae, for fatherland, well, frames it in terms of nationalism, also excluding others. So it can be a dangerous motto. I spoke with a German colleague, and he emphasized that immediately. They have a history of well, sometimes adding rather than Patriae, the Kaiser, the German emperor, or other ways of framing this as a dangerous motto. That's not how it functioned in the Holland society. There was never, I think, this kind of appeal to divine authority. It was more a kind of framework, and it certainly started in a very particular Protestant mode and also particular metaphysical orientation, but that has become rather pluralistic, very flexible. So this was not so much, I think, the danger. There's a second way of looking at the motto, and that's more neutral, seeing it as a historic curiosity, a dignifying expression, like this building we have, this 18th century home. Yeah, we could also do our work in a more modern building, but it does give a certain has a certain charm to do it in that kind of building. Or if you look at the words of the Dutch national anthem, it certainly is out of date. It refers to the King of Spain being our Lord, our King, and other elements that are totally out of tune with how we see ourselves. But it's our national anthem. And there's so much else in culture and language, kind of symbolic culture, that you say, well, we wouldn't say it that way, but given that it's there, it's acceptable. That may be not enough. We recently had elections in the Netherlands, and there were clearly outspoken, well, conservative right-wing parties, but there was action by the main winner of the elections of a progressive liberal party, who at some point displayed very prominently the Dutch flag. And that would have been a nationalistic symbol that would have been appropriated by the by the right-wing type of figures. And he said, no, that is our history, appropriating that, not letting those symbols being hijacked in a sense for only a conservative kind of agenda. So if you say it's neutral, you still have to oppose, I think, the more dangerous versions of using those kind of historic legacies. Uh, I also think actually that there is a positive meaning. This is again part of this prize medal. Um, speaking of God, um, here functions, I think, as suggesting that science stands in a larger frame that encourages curiosity and awe, that is open to, allows for open questions and a sense of mystery, and also a culture of appreciating knowledge and a culture of gratitude for what's given, but at the same time acknowledging our human limitations by putting it in a larger frame. I think those kind of motives may be far more acceptable. I tried this in this lecture at this annual meeting, and also some of the, well, people who were consider themselves non-religious were not offended by this interpretation, were not afterwards saying, well, we should discard this motto. And the reference to our fatherland, our country, historically, it's clearly that science is done out of a sense of responsibility, given where we are. And for the Dutch, that was, of course, this culture with the threats of the sea and the rivers and water. So science is done out of responsibility, out of care for the people. It was never very nationalistic in the sense of emphasizing boundaries. Prizes were also given to people from other countries. The horizon was wider, and today, of course, should be even more wider, planetary. So I think actually that motto, if people are willing to read it into it, can also have a positive meaning and not just be a remnant of the past that is only a burden. But it's part of a kind of cultural tension how one reads and uses a motto like that today. I think this was my last slide. Yes, that is the end of my presentation for now.
And now we're going to have a response from Katie Hinman, who is the program director at DOSER, which is the Dialogue on Science, Ethics, and Religion at the American Association for the Advancement of Science. She's originally from Decatur, Georgia, and earned a BA in biology from Carleton College, a PhD in ecology and evolution from the State University of New York at Stony Brook, and an MDiv from Candler School of Theology at Emory University. Her dissertation research focused on bat pollination of agave plants in southeastern Arizona. She was also the executive director of Georgia Interfaith Power and Light, a nonprofit that works with faith communities on environmental issues. Prior to joining DOSER, Dr. Hinman was the pastor at College Park First United Methodist Church in College Park, Georgia. Welcome, Katie.
Thank you so much, Dan, and thank you so much, Wim, for that really interesting conversation and looking into the history of how society and the words that are established at its inception can influence the work that's being done and how people see it. I was reflecting in thinking about responding to this kind of what purpose a motto serves for an organization, and both for the folks within an organization and for those outside of the organization, because I think that's a key element in how we think about these phrases that oftentimes are can be sort of throwaway or something that appears on letterhead and nowhere else. but they do have real meaning and they can carry real meaning. And one of the challenges, I think, but also one of the opportunities that comes with things like that that are a way of representing a group or an organization is thinking about the meaning that they have for those within the organization and the group, and for those without. In particular, I was thinking about, as you were talking at the end, about whether this is still an appropriate motto, the ways that a motto or a mission statement sort of communicates what drives and inspires the work of an organization, as well as what keeps it in check. What is an organization accountable to and accountable for? And I think that is one of the important things that's communicated through these sorts of phrases is, what is driving us, and also who are we accountable to? And it's interesting that you pointed out that, of course, a lot of the sort of mottos and the law in the establishment of HMW didn't even mention science, which, coming from the American Association for the Advancement of Science, our mission is, you gave the sort of shortened version of the mission, which is advancing science and serving society. The longer version is to advance science, engineering, and innovation throughout the world for the benefit of all. So right in there, of course, we've got science front and center, that sort of talks about, what drives us in terms of advancing this mode of inquiry and benefiting society. But it does, I think, a bit lack that other part of what are we accountable to? I mean, I guess we are accountable to serving society and advancing science for the benefit of all. But this motto that incorporates the religious language provides, and political language provides, an accountability structure that I think might be missing in some of these other mottos and other mission statements. And I think that, as this could just seem like a interesting historical explanation, but I think it's something that's important for us to think about with regard to the organizations that we are a part of, that it's impossible, of course, to incorporate all of what we do or want to do in a very short number of words. But thinking about how those words communicate to people from the outside of the organization, what we do, what really drives the work that we are doing, why is this important, and what are we accountable to? I think that balance provides a framework of thinking about how we can advance our work in a way that also sort of is supported and valued by folks who are not part of this enterprise, are not scientists, are not engineers. I think one of the other pieces that I think is somewhat missing from the Deo et Patriae is the collaborative or interdisciplinary opportunities of a society or an organization, which is something that I think, I will promote AAAS here, but think that our mission does incorporate somewhat. And I think it's important to think about, again, how we are thinking about what it means to be part of an enterprise together, not just individually, but what it means to be collaborating together within this framework, whether that is a motto or mission statement or the larger framework of society or the communities that we're part of. And I think this kind of leads me a little bit into I apparently get the privilege of asking the first question. So Wim, if you want to turn your camera back on, because I think one of the challenges that that we talk a lot about, especially in the US right now, is this question about trust in science. And again, what do people who are outside of the scientific enterprise think about science, and are they trusting in science? And the issue that you brought up around appeals to authority really kind of made me think about this. You talked about the Enlightenment representing a shift away from appealing to the authority of the church or the state. I'm interested to hear your thoughts about the ways that we might be sort of placing science writ large into that position of authority that we are now not giving to the church or the state. When we talk about trust in science within scientific circles, at least in the US, there sometimes is this sort of implicit idea that, of course, people should trust science because it's science. Again, of course, people should trust the church because it's the church. Of course, people should trust, the state because it's the state. And so I'm just curious if you see that, that sort of danger of, just trading out an appeal to authority from one place to another, rather than sort of a reflection on what it means to appeal to a given authority without reflection or humility, I guess.
Thank you very much. Yeah, I think that's also your earlier remarks, just to brief the purpose of a motto, saying it's important for the people within, kind of inspiring the group, but also for people outside. And there's of course the risk of what with inside may be accepted and understood by all is not in the same way necessarily understood by outsiders. So the misunderstanding type of risks there, and the challenge. Yeah. But let me on this last topic, trust in science. Yeah, I think we don't have the extreme political context that I read nowadays about, especially in health and climate kind of topics. But something similar happens, and I see two responses to people who are concerned. One is, well, we need to explain the science more, teach it again and again and again, kind of popularize maybe. And actually, that assumes that people don't understand the science. And actually, those who don't like the science often are not stupid. They're often fairly well informed. It's something I learned decades ago in discussion about creationism or intelligent design. They would have read a lot about evolution. And it's even, that's different. It's even not necessarily against the scientific ideas in the context of science, but it's concerned about, does science make life better? It's trust to rely on science for political or social developments. The smartphone may be wonderful instrument, but has it made our lives better? What has it done? So it's I think by and large science itself. There's recently again an international survey is more or less the most trusted kind of institution worldwide, and also by religious people. United States is slightly different there, I think, but certainly in other circles. But the issue is using science in for political conclusions or other things. Then at least it should be open. I think that there are concerns there, and that part of the social political conclusions don't come from the science, but come from other judgments that we bring to it that we may stand for, but that are more moral and uh, views than only the science. And I think part of the debate about trust in science is that that people do not necessarily disagree on the science, but they disagree on the role we give science.
Well, thank you so much. I think I am supposed to now turn it back over to Dan for other questions.
Yeah, so we have a few questions. The first from Calvin Chatlos. I don't know if it's a question or a comment, but you may comment on it. So it seems odd that God becomes the natural world of science and country becomes the godly goal of the human spirit, compassion and mission or purpose.
Yes. Yeah, I think, well, when it's odd, but I do think the reference to country, as I understand it, is indeed the kind of moral appeal that we are responsible and need compassion, care for the world, for people elsewhere, so that it fits there. That is, uh, well, that is also the easier part in a sense to have consensus on that. That's part of what we want to achieve, not only promote the sciences, but the sciences that serve society in a helpful way. Even though there's, of course, then a discussion about what's serving society. If the other half, the God reference, is the more well, there's less consensus there. There's more divergence. Uh, what was the nature of the comment? That it's odd that stands for the world of science. Well, in a sense, it stands not for the world as we know it through science, but the kind of attitude that comes with science, which is, I think, an attitude not only of claiming answers, but also of seeing that there again and again further questions to be asked, and that there's with all the answers we have still a sense of mystery and gratitude. So that, at least for me, the religious language is more effective than theoretical in kind.
Hmm. Okay. And a question from Paul Carr. Uh, Please comment on the evolutionary science of Darwin, who was an esteemed member of the Royal Scientific Society. Many in the religious establishment opposed Darwinian evolution.
Yes. Well, maybe starting on this last one, uh, I don't think that is really the case. There are many in the religious establishment there that accepted it. There's a famous book by James Moore, Darwin's Forgotten Defenders, where he points out Asa Gray and others who were fairly conservative by modern standards in their religious orientation, but had no problem in accepting evolution as part of their way of understanding it. So I think that the responses to Darwin were divergent, that there was an acceptance among more liberal ones. There's a famous English, well, there's a sermon, for instance, at the British Association for the Advancement of Science in Darwin's book is 1859. This is the year thereafter or so. Uh, there's a famous exchange and a clash between Bishop Wilberforce and Huxley, which is often used to emphasize the conflict. But there was also a sermon on this at this conference, which was embracing Darwinism by someone who later became an archbishop, I think, of Canterbury. So not a insignificant type of figure. So it's more divergent, I think. Arthur Peacock in the modern time has been typical of someone who has this Anglican way of reconciling it. In the meantime, looking whether Darwin was also a member. Yeah, Francis. Even three Darwins, yes, but also Charles Darwin was member of our society. So I think the acceptance as well, but that was of course in a period when advancing the sciences was the purpose, and the religious frame was less kind of shared frame at that time.
Okay, and another question from Paul Carr, comment on Adams and Jefferson's separation of church and state. So, I guess from a Dutch point of view, perhaps, given there's an established religion.
No, we don't have an
Oh,
established
it isn't
religion.
established there
No,
now.
some of the Scandinavian countries have had an established religion. We
Okay,
have, at least since the Napoleonic time, for instance, a marriage is always a civil procedure. And then afterwards, you can have a blessing in the church of your choosing, but it can't be performed by the church. So that's a typical example, I think, of a separation kind of idea. I'm not sure particularly about Adams and Jefferson, but I think the American culture, of course, was originally the separation was aligned with pluralism, with allowing different groups their own version. I remember Robert Bellah, an American sociologist, having a lecture on more or less this theme, I think, and we owe it to the Baptists, in a sense, because the Baptists may be kind of pushing and have moved to the more right wing, but they were part of those minorities that wanted to have their own religion. So the separation was also to protect the different versions, different ways of understanding religion. And I think that's still an important part of the separation of church and state, to allow for pluralism in one sphere, whereas the state needs to come to conclusions. You need to work together. Yeah. But I'm not sure about Adams and Jefferson in particular.
I thought maybe it was more Madison. I'm not sure, but anyway, yeah, we're not political scientists here. So, I actually have a question. I know Holland is often what Americans call the entire Netherlands, and I know it's just one province. So, I gather this organization is the Royal Holland Society of Sciences. So it's in that province, but does it represent the country as a whole, or is there a relation there?
Yes. At the time of its founding in the 18th century, there were those 7 provinces united, and it was a lot more a federal structure than really a united country. So this Holland was regional, but the membership actually came from the whole country and also from abroad, from outside, right from the beginning. Um, but its seat was clearly in Holland, and it tried to get the permission of the states of Holland, the province. Uh, so yeah, um, actually, then late 18th century, you have this revolutionary period in the French Revolution, but we had a moderate version of it as well. And actually, they abolished the provinces. So at that point, you get a unified country. And we also get a unified currency, for instance. Up to that point, different provinces had different currencies and different ways of measuring length and whatever. Uh, uh, and when after the French period, um, when after Napoleon, we were part of the French Empire under Napoleon for a while, and then after Waterloo, um, there was some consideration whether we should return to this frame Holland, which at that point, early 19th century, was understood to refer to the whole of the Netherlands. So it shifted, in a sense, the term from being more regional to being the whole of the Netherlands. And that's how we understand it nowadays.
Oh, okay.
But there is also the Royal Netherlands Academy of Sciences, to be confusing. And they were founded under the French king, brother of Napoleon, 1808, because he tried to annex our society and to be the model after the French Academy of Sciences. And our citizens didn't want to accept that. The scientists were willing to go along, but the directors not. And then this king founded a second scholarly society, and they are actually the more politically more relevant one.
Hmm.
And they are called Netherlands rather than Holland. Otherwise, we are often confused.
Okay.
Could I ask one more question?
Sure.
I was just, thinking about the sort of interdisciplinary nature of the society um, and the kind of going back to this question about sort of the framing of of the Deo part in particular, kind of putting a framework of curiosity and awe and hopefully maybe some humility into the sort of structure or ideal of a society. I'm curious, my feeling is that encouraging folks to be in interdisciplinary spaces where they're interacting with folks that are experts in wildly different fields can be a good way of sort of reinforcing some of that humility. And I was just curious if you had any thoughts about other sort of concepts or phrases maybe that didn't have necessarily the religious connotation that might invoke some of that same sense of humility and awe and place.
Yes. Well, at least the need also for collaboration across disciplines. I think that comes up in many ways, talking about, uh, well, wicked problems, complex problems. We have a series of symposia on transitions, which are social phenomena, say energy transition or all kinds of issues that bring together, well, different perspectives and different things. Um, this kind of affective awe, I'm not so sure that that is explicit somewhere. That is very much left, I think, to individual persons. But kind of need for the interdisciplinary, certainly. For instance, we have dissertation prizes, and some are disciplinary defined along disciplinary lines, but there's one actually that is explicit for interdisciplinary dissertations, and then a broad sense of this interdisciplinarity. We had a linguist working on in psychiatry how patients speak, not which words they say, but how they speak, intonation and things like that. Typically, issues linguists look at, but then how does it show particular mental concerns? So that's typically an example of well, different disciplines uh, helpfully working together. And there are many more of those, of course.
I do have a question that I'd like to just raise. And Katie, you can respond to this too, because in the United States, currently, there's confusion in the public's mind about what science leads to. We have, as you know, a split in the public sector with the current government. And in public health, for example, when the secretary dismisses the entire advisory panel and then appoints new people who a number of whom are identified with theories that have been debunked by the consensus in the scientific academy. Nevertheless, the secretary says we're gonna have this new panel and we're gonna follow the science. It's always we're gonna follow the science, and yet they're following theories that have been debunked by science. So the public, it's easy to understand why the public is so confused about the entire public health issue at this point. And
Yes.
I wonder, Wim, have you encountered that kind of thing, that the debunked theories that proliferate, particularly on the social media, get new life, as it were, by these actions of persons in public responsibility?
Yes. Now, there's a very fundamental issue because science, well, there's this consensus formation, but then there's always the openness to challenges. And maybe so people, there's this kind of philosophy of science problem that, say, Popper is a famous philosopher of science. The emphasis on falsification suggests, oh, we shouldn't go for the consensus. Whereas there's also a reason to trust the consensus. I think that the those who don't like the consensus type of science still call them appeal to science, as they call it, is itself a tribute to the standing of science, of course, that they want to present it in those terms. In terms of the discussion about creationism, biblical creationism. Well, actually, the first half of the 20th century, it wasn't scientific creationism. It was biblical creationism or just creationism. And it becomes scientific creationism with arguments about the flood or fossil records being incomplete or all kinds of pseudo-scientific type of arguments somewhere in the 1960s or so when there's a strong push for science, it also becomes a kind of push for scientific creationism. And of course, one of the examples in American literature is Naomi Oreskes and who is the other author, Merchants of Doubt, how in the tobacco lobby, climate lobby, how there has been an appeal to scientists who were relatively marginal among their colleagues, but by those with particular interests to undermine the main insight about tobacco and cancer and all kinds of modern insights. So this Merchants of Doubt is, I think, a very good, well, study of that phenomenon. And for the solution, I don't know.
Yeah, I understand. Well, maybe Katie, you can comment. How does the AAS handle that kind of thing?
Well, it's an ongoing challenge that we face. And of course, there's, this whole conversation around misinformation and disinformation, sort of intentional misinformation as well as just, unintentional misinformation. And I think, it's interesting that Wim points out that even the way, though, that this disinformation is presented indicates that science is held in esteem, but it also indicates that we don't do a good job of educating people about how science works and what it means. We have done such a disservice by treating, sort of allowing this view of science as a set of facts to proliferate rather than sort of the process of science. And we saw this during COVID in particular, where the communication about what sorts of preventive measures people should be taking changes because we are getting more information. This is how science works. As we get more information, we're able to update our understanding and make hopefully more accurate recommendations about prevention. But because we haven't done a good job of communicating that that's how science works, what people hear is, well, you told me this last week, and this week you're telling me something completely different. I can't trust you.
Yeah.
You were lying to me. And so I think that is a big challenge for us in our, kind of long term in our educational system, is how are we helping people understand science as a process rather than a set of facts and figures.
Yeah.
And so that's, a lot of what we talk about when we are thinking about STEM education and those sorts of things, as well as, what can we do now to sort of stem the tide of misinformation and disinformation.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, and AAS has now established a specific department on science communication. So communication is a key aspect of this. Wim, do you have a last word? Are you okay?
I'm okay.
Okay, listen, thank you so much, Wim. People should appreciate the fact that it's the hour is approaching midnight where you are.
Past midnight.
And okay, so this is a major thank you for your commitment to do this webinar for us. We appreciate it very much. And Katie, thank you for your comments as well as respondent. And thanks to Dan for serving as moderator, and JD Stillwater, who's been managing the Tech Center today.
I will thank them very much for an interesting discussion, and Katie for helping out with the discussion and questions.